When you try to think of a good title to talk about something, you have to think about what its message does to resonate with you. Whether it be good or bad, it all depends on what you can take away from the most being easily applied to reality. To which this video took me longer than I expected to really talk about after its initial release period, other YouTubers talking about it, and several other topics in other videos I've mentioned. Of course referring to Raya and the Last Dragon, released in 2021. A film noted for its messages about trust and the world and the basis of Southeast Asian culture to some degree. Two things that were the subject of heavy criticism for presenting it in such a way or fashion, where it wasn't really the greatest execution despite visually looking great. Because this is a film that has the right intentions with the messages and taking place within such an environment, but within its executions, it breaks it rather than makes it good that apparently most people outside of the video review bubble seem to have liked. Talking about this because I have friends who stream at Disneyland who actually talked positively about watching it again, which inspired this whole video. And this doesn't mean you shouldn't like it like they did, because there's actually a lot to appreciate about this film, understanding why with having such a fun cast and terrific action for a Disney film, but it also doesn't absolve the underlying issue that the story could have done to be better. Some people have advocated to work better for a series, which I disagree, where it should have remained to be a film that it wanted to be, but how it's also based on its weird episodic structure which Disney Animation has apparently gone into, but not even gotten out of this day looking at the sequel I laid my eyes upon recently. Also, there is the problem that this film insists upon itself with its anachronistic nature from characters like Raya and Sisu herself, as we will discuss as a major issue to make Disney such a quirky relatable storytelling studio, which should never have been the case, harming the greater message and setting of the world when it wants to do much more. Because why do any of this regardless if it's for entertaining kids if you want your theme to actually have an impact? Seeing the best moments be affected by short slapstick comedy that belongs in the modern era and not the past, which hurts the reputation of the studio. Just like the company hurting its own films during this time with its Disney Plus releases during COVID that sort of changed the attitude when it comes to watching films like this until recently when they found their foot back with the ideas that they needed with billion-dollar hit after billion-dollar hit again until their eventual failures because they're not satisfying the audience anymore. And I myself really do believe it deserved more, and it's one I do not like to hate, really wanting to actually love it but just couldn't, not even now with rewatching it yet again at the behest of what my friends told me. So the true purpose of this entire video is to discuss what not to do when it comes to trusting stories, and learn when it should be a big focus aging for the better or worse despite what the majority of reviewers can say. So starting things off, we have to go back to the production of the film when it was announced back in 2019, with Awkwafina joining the cast alongside Cassie Steele. But how that changed back in 2020 with the title character now played by Kelly Mary Tran as Raya, who played Rose Tico in the sequel trilogy, alongside the new directors with the original ones just becoming co-directors of this very film, where it just seems that most of this shuffle came at the cost of COVID since it actually took place during that time. One of the new ones in this instance happens to be Don Hall, who has co-directed several other Disney films starting out with Winnie the Pooh, Big Hero 6, and then lately of course with Strange World, which makes things unfortunate and makes sense for this film for him because I don't think he's bad at helming these films, but the way both Raya and Strange World would turn out to be left a lot more to be desired and expected, and overall they're just disappointing. And the fact that this film was worked mostly through COVID back in 2020 makes matters a little more harder for what they wanted to work with.
We were really worried when the work from home era started because collaboration's such key to the way that Disney animation movies are made.
The collaboration doesn't stop within the walls of a room. It happens in between meetings when you're going up and down those stairs.
Most people completing their work at their homes during this time, as did other stories released like Encanto. But just speaking in terms of the case of this film, it just seems like so many people were brought on to work out something for an original story where they couldn't seem to fully grasp yet when it comes to elements of the world and the cultural background, which we already said was subject to various criticism during its time about 4 years ago. Something you probably have seen before, but not a big focus since I can't speak much about that region. Although it does point out that I would love more Disney stories to take place in areas like Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, or Burma, where it just seems like a very interesting place with a vast ancient history, much like China had with Mulan. Like, it's great that they decided to go with the unifying identity of this nation called Kumandra, but that doesn't make up for its lack of a grand narrative. But back to their choice of characters, was aiming for someone with an attitude similar to Peter Quill, what they found with Kelly, where she showed more of their unique qualities that they were looking for, rather than contrasted with a more stoic, serious tone. You see this attitude at the start of the intro with the mysterious figure traversing the plains of Kumandra. the lands that these people inhabit, who reveals herself as Raya, narrating events of the current time and before. The fields are just filled with mysterious stone statues and an ominous atmosphere described as dystopian, separated by different tribes. Kumandra was revealed to be the name of what the united tribes of these lands were called when the people lived in peace with dragons, with the entire layout being shaped like a dragon. These dragons gave people water and other life-supporting sustenance that made life a paradise until this force called the Druun arrived, turning any living form they came into contact with stone. They are also regarded as the main antagonists of the film for the reason that they cause death and destruction to the land rather than what we all come to know and what we're going to learn about in the infuriating truth of a character known as Namari, where they managed to consume all the dragons except for Sisu, who succeeded in putting their magic into a gem that expelled the Druun away, saving everyone except for her family, the dragons. By this point, you can probably tell that the dragons and the Druuns are meant to be the light and the dark side of what they are as forces of life and death, and how they are not back, where because of it, humans being humans wanted power of the dragon magic rather than unite around it as a lesson to carry on. That Kumandra became a divided nation between tribes because of our own selfish nature, which is where the broader message lies in terms of speaking of our divisions as a human race that harms us in the modern world, yet how it's not the main message as trust that will take center stage and Raya's own worlds that she broke because of what she did to allow it. This leads to events over 500 years later with the younger Raya traversing the land to where the gem lies, which turns out to be guarded by none other as her father with a lesson. This is where I have to point out something great, which is the soundtrack of the film provided by James Newton Howard, who scored many great Disney films including the likes of Atlantis as his last project until this one, where he does a good job providing a tone for the environment inspired by different regions from the world, from Indonesia to even China itself, but blended in its non-specific way, which works very well despite the stigma around the story culture. Her father is Chief Benja of the Heart Tribe, who seeks to reunite everyone once again, to become Kumandra, where all the tribes currently inhabit a specific aspect of the dragon for their name, including the likes of Talon, Tail, Spire, and Fang, alongside Heart that makes up the entire body as we see in the maps above. Everyone is divided basically on the assumption that the dragon gem gives prosperity or other abilities to a tribe, yet how it's not really the case since it was there to protect them from the Druun. When they meet, they all still disagree with each other greatly, suspicious of this meeting, but how Raya stands out to offer them to eat at the behest of her father, which a young girl decides to accept this offer from Fang, specifically the daughter of the chiefess Varana, who is known as Namari, aka the reason why this film actually sucks at all, as we will continue to see. Because there's no greater disappointment than a character with underlying goals that turn out not to be what you think in the logical way that a story should be built, with her growing a relationship with Raya, bonding over their love of the dragon Sisu. From here, she discusses how Fang does have holes on the inside, meaning it's broken, and wishes that a dragon back in the wild could fix things for the better, and possibly bring Kumandra in Raya's mind, which he relates greatly with and decides to trust her, leading to the dragon gemstone that her father wanted to see, because of the grand lesson of this film relates to his own teaching to trust each other once again, where the reason why they're all named after a part of a dragon is because they were one nation living harmoniously, where if they don't trust each other again or connect, it all leads to the complete destruction of us all. I mean, I get that's a great message and all, and important for all of us to learn, yet how it has to be from a mediated level rather than what the film teaches us to be full on, because people will betray us like that, just like Namari does in this instance, completely wiping this message off the face of the earth to steal the gem, which causes chaos when everyone finds out about this, going back to arguing about what's happening. Like, what we can derive here is that Namari should be the apparent villain, acting literally villainous to Raya and trying to fight her for the gem, the most you would actually apparently ever see in this film, to try to get to fight Raya and the rest of the hidden forces before her father comes back to plead them to stop. Yet how we learn, she is actually not going to be the villain of the film like everyone else, who are just arguing over the fact that they're trying to steal the gem, breaking it and reawakening the Druun once again, causing chaos where they pick the pieces for themselves and retreat to their tribes. A fact that shows that trust was actually broken and overall broke the world again, with various other people getting stoned once more, just like her father, who sacrificed himself to save Raya and do what's right years later. A fact that we're now going to have to see what's Raya going to do to try to reunite everyone once again and probably stop Namari from whatever plans Fang has for their evil intentions. At least, that's what you think, as I just said, they are not actually villainous. And this leads us to 6 years later, where older Raya with a bigger tuk-tuk traversed the country to search for Sisu. This search comes after the knowledge of learning of what Namari taught her, that she could be found near the end of a river after what she did to restore the world when they search in the deserts of Talon. So she reaches the end of the water and starts to summon Sisu, which actually works to a great surprise, but how we find out that it's an animated Aquafina character. I say this in a way because this character is immediately figured out as the comic relief who happened to save the world a long time ago and actually didn't create the gem itself, but used it to activate its powers, as it does connect her to her siblings' powers. Like, her portrayal of the character is probably supposed to be similar to the genie, bent on having these weird anachronistic lines to connect to us folks present day, but it actually doesn't work quite well and is more comparable to Mushu as dragons, but not even as good as Mushu in that regard too. We're infusing the characters with these features, quipping about things that don't work in this world just drags the story down considering the bigger world at play. Sure, it's fun and all, but hearing stuff like this just doesn't make sense to trust it.
I'm a wicked when I hit that liquid. I got water skills that kill. I slaughter when I hit the water. I'm like, really good at swimming. Oh, this beetle's got a booty.
Really? Just really? You just had to add lines like beetles having booties in here? You see what I mean? I just get taken out of Disney films when they try to do stuff like this. I mean, okay, sure, it's better than what Disney would do with her later on with things like Scuttlebutt.
Remember the swap?
But I just want the real wonder of the story and not the style your rivals or studios like DreamWorks are better known for with these quippy modern dialogues. But anyways, Raya catches her up to speed on the gems where each chief has a piece of them taken from that moment earlier in the film, but how each time we get to see them, we realize that most of them are probably now dead, like the tail chief who tried to trap anyone from getting close to her but probably went too far and died as a result. Like, you understand now for the most part, unlike Raya and then Verana and Namari, most of these tribal leaders have been taken out of the film, maybe to put into perspective of how bad things went when they decided to separate, but also a weird step that shows how fast things tend to move in this film with such an idea, and then going on to each kingdom like it's an episodic series arc, which is not the best structure for films of this type. The next gem actually gives Sisu her sister's powers to shapeshift, turning her into a human for the first time as a great disguise when people like Namari come in, and also teaches us that these gems carry power of the pieces of her own siblings.
Look how close my butt is to my head.
The grown-up Namari in this film just happens to be played by Gemma Chan, who unfortunately did not star in the greatest Disney films released this year, considering Raya playing characters like Namari, and then later on in Eternals for Marvel, knowing how that went down back in 2021. Because 2021 for the most part wasn't the best year for Disney, with more misses than they had hits. I mean, they did have big hits and they were very good still, but they still had things like this. And then you go back to being annoyed at this film because Raya can also quip back and forth with Namari, making this film weirdly modern than what it needs to be.
What can I say? Bling is my thing.
Which is just very sad and weird to talk about because in a deleted scene of this very scene, we see that Raya was more balanced and acted more appropriate for the situation, because we really don't need to have this dialogue or quippy back and forth just to make it relatable to some degree, or just have the character have some spicy attitude towards it. Like, we don't need that, we just need a story to enjoy and that can be timeless. This still doesn't mean that 100 years later people would mind of them talking about this, since this film still takes place in a broader time outside of our own, but you know, for history-wise, it just doesn't make sense to do so. And, you know, it's a little petty, but it's something I have to complain about. Because the attitude these characters take on just takes me out of the times, because you enter this ancient Southeast Asian period world, but how the characters are going out of their way to be quirky that makes no sense at all. It's the same criticism overall for Disney during this era that we talked about before, that started out with Tangled for good reasons of the character that was balanced out, but slowly crept into everything they did apparently, last seen in Wish with Asha's character, to make things worse as the amalgamation of things and scenes like this. But at least what we can take away from this scene is that Namari still acts as a threat to Raya to try to stop her, still being that villainous image from stealing these gem pieces and laughing at her assumptions to find Sisu, chasing her all the way to the shore until they meet Captain Boone, a 10-year-old boy who runs this ship and cooking business, taking them out for a fee. And I just want to stress this point and say villain each time Namari appears on screen, because every time we actually look at her and contrast with the actions of Raya, we are still under the assumption that she is the villain of the film. She did cause events in the first place, and that's what we're going to try to get out of this. But how later on, you learn that the film does not want to show us this perspective, shifting to an understandable one that creates all of these points mute because they were not aiming for making a villain at all in these stories. But back to Captain Boone is where we find out that he resides here in Tail, serving as the representative for this very region since all the chiefs are dead or missing to some degree. Traversing across these plains, we see more statues of these lost dragons caused by the Drune, where Sisu says they do act like the opposite of dragons themselves, consuming life into nothing but ash, and rather than the life that they provide, taking all of their families. But how hope still relies within the stone, that the fact that they can be restored using the gem, as we will see later on, not being lost, but preserved for a united future. So the next step is to go to Talon to retrieve the gem from Deng Hai, running into their second group with Little Noi, a baby con artist who hangs out with the Ongis, stealing gems from Raya until she catches them and offers to join in and help. Meanwhile, we do get this weird sequence with Sisu running into trouble wanting to give gifts to the tribal leaders by using credit, introducing this concept to her since she doesn't have money to pay them back, where the people believe is just straight up stealing from them because she isn't known to them or even trustworthy to do so, reminding us all of the good perspective that we're trying to learn, proving another point that shows that blind trust should never be warranted in situations like this, yet how the film goes in the opposite direction for its final message. So Little Noi on the other hand distracts the guards while Raya reaches the top to get the gem piece, but reveals a dark truth about Deng Hai.
I'm not Deng Hai, I'm Chai. The flower guy?
Yep, this film just loves to be this kind of comedy, doesn't it? When Deng Hai was actually turned into stone, doing worse for all the other chiefs in this adventure, overall realizing that they're just doing this as an episodic journey type of story to go place to place to get a gem. Where you understand the perspective of some people who would want it to be a series rather, because it doesn't feel like a proper movie despite having the quality to show for it. Like it wants to do this, but does the other thing to make it something else. Where this instance, Deng Hai was probably tricked by Deng Hu, who happens to be leading Sisu on because she has the gem piece. Like, they do call her the most vicious chief that they ever had, where it's probably true to a degree because she does threaten to have the Drune turn Sisu into stone like she probably did with Deng Hai, stating this brutal truth to them.
But I trusted you. Big mistake.
More and more, this film loves to throw these situations to us, reminding a real fact that trusting people isn't always a good thing. But then on the other hand, how it's going to be that way because it wants you to trust overall. I know that's a statement that doesn't really make any sense, but when you reach the end, you realize how points like this are wasted for the true meaning that they wanted rather than reality. To have Sisu remind us that trusting someone is the best thing to do, even though they actually strictly betray you in this situation. Because it makes Raya right in her beliefs to not trust anyone because of people like that, even though she can also be wrong about that totality, which is fine to break, but not in the way it should have been when we managed to go back to Fang. Here, as we discuss, Verana is still chiefess of this land, artificially separated from the water, but also in need of expanding for resources. The scene is where Namari comes back to ask her mother to intercept Raya before she gets more gem pieces, as it is done to contrast Raya's belief in not trusting anyone, where her mother wants to act smart and rational about their decisions dealing with the Drune, considering Namari's emotional connection to Raya, but how she values this as the only right decision for them to secure their future to expand. That the only way they can actually expand is to get the gem pieces for themselves, which is a bit selfish on their part and still reminds us that they could be villains, that is done for the self-preservation and goal to survive, compared to the real point of Raya's father saying to unite under Kumandra, where the only real way to expand is to accept each other back under that one nation. And how on the movie's behalf of how events play out, it proves how she's not on the side to be trusted, since from the start they aren't really there for Kumandra but themselves. The right of why people don't trust Fang, because they cause greater divisions, as their name represents the sharp teeth of a dragon that bites into things that they like. Where even though you get to understand such a passionate perspective of wanting the best for her people, you also get a more solidified notion of someone who's not to be trusted for their own interests. She portrayed that long ago, making friends with Raya, who believed in their relationship that could make Kumandra a reality, but how that's not in their beliefs to do so. And that's exactly what Raya keeps trying to tell Sisu, despite her own positive belief that is supposed to match her father's despite the difficulties, even after everything she's seen so far, that people do not trust her.
That's what the world is now. You can't trust anyone.
Where she wants to still try to believe in that we do have good in the world, but how Raya gave up because people are people, which is actually understandable and true in a lot of cases, but to remind us just how actually some cannot be trusted to do the right thing at all. Just look at history itself and you can see who you can really trust. A great example here is the 1930s and the 1940s with the partition of several countries for one big bad wolf who stabbed both sides in the back during World War II when they were attacked. But Sisu on the other hand doesn't want to listen to that message and runs off the spine to prove a point that you can actually give a little trust to someone and they would fully agree with that point despite the issues we talked about earlier. Just like the part where they get caught in a trap by the last surviving member of Spine named Tong, played of course by the one and only Benedict Wong, or just Wong as we know him in the MCU. The Droon happened to decimate all of Spine, leaving him here all alone to fester until the crew asked him to join and help because of their unifying loss of their own people, and of course Namari and the crew attacking. Where the fun thing about Raya is actually the cast of characters together, where they sure somewhat join in on their own anachronistic personality of Raya and Sisu, but do it in a manner that suffices and copes with the loss that they experience, and they're just a lot of fun. A fine balance where you can enjoy that within their presence as a highlight of what the film exceeds at doing, that they deserve better for what they are learning about in this journey, where she decides to free them all while distracting Namari so they could get the gems out of the way. Also where you have to admire the fight scenes of the film because they put effort into making this an action-packed feature, which we don't see quite often in the sense of princess type stories since they are considered princesses of their own chiefdoms. And the great thing about this entire scene is that she gets beaten down bad, almost defeated by Namari in this instance, who still acts like the villain, doing everything in her power to defeat Raya at all costs, but how she can't be considered as such when Sisu turns back into the dragon to save her and shock her that the legend is alive, that they managed to escape because of it, and it changes something inside of her, apparently for the time, while people ask why Raya wouldn't tell them such a truth that she was Sisu all along, where they all wish to actually join and help them to bring back the gem to restore their families once more so they can try to stop the Droon for good, giving her more powers flying or jumping in the sky as the rain falls, because water is something they don't like as Droon as it provides life to the land. So they try to come up with a plan to infiltrate Fang with the dumbest ideas possible, like Sisu going to Namari saying, "Let's be best friends and all is forgiven," to show us of course the unrealistic perspectives that can exist with trust, but for the overall goal that they really want Raya to actually do.
If we're just honest with her, deep down, I got a feeling she wants to fix the world as much as we do.
Everyone actually dislikes this plan because Fang is actually the root of evil in this world, but how Sisu cannot accept that state because maybe her heart is good enough to actually save the world, which it is technically true by her passionate desire, but it's again the same selfish desire to save Fang and not Kumandra on the whole, still reminding us that her actions out of her own people rather than the rest of the entire land. So she takes Raya back to her own home and heart, where her father is still stoned, going back up where the gem was used last, and by extent to place where her brothers and sisters were last buried. From there we learn that they combine all their powers in this gem and gave it to Sisu, where they just chose Sisu out of all of them to fulfill this message despite not having greater powers like they did since she related to only water, and how overall they decided to put their full trust and faith into her because she did the same thing with them, and why she deserved to save humanity from complete destruction from that very time. Where the lesson here is that she could do the same thing with Namari and put that faith for her to do the right thing and forgive the past.
When they put their faith in me, it empowered me beyond anything I could imagine. The same can happen with Namari.
But the problem here is that she's using her own family as a comparison to another tribal leader, people who hardly know each other outside of these short-lived meetings compared to living with people you know in your whole entire life. You just cannot make the assumption of that based on your own experience with what Raya tries to explain. We just don't know them well enough and they act out of their own beliefs and not yours. Two people, unless they apparently come from the same family, do not share the same set of ideals. It just doesn't work that way at all, as Namari and Raya's relationship are more similar to say something of how the Soviets and Germany made a pact for a time and then the Germany betrayed that when they invaded them a few years later. That it's similar to that sense of them trusting to make an agreement on issues to have peace until they stab each other in the back for their own territorial gain. And that's something you cannot forgive or trust them to do the right thing anymore. Of course, not to the point of a world war where you must utterly defeat your enemy, but how you cannot rely on her motives to be trustworthy at all at any point in your life. It's super flawed even though you think it might be the right thing to do to make her father's dream come true, since they were going back to Verona to confirm that everyone actually blames them despite Namari's changed perspective that Sisu could probably help, where it just does present a difficult choice that she has to make now knowing that Sisu Sisu is alive and that her mother wants to have other plans to make them look good once again rather than what she specifically did. A conflict that sets her on a good path apparently to be forgiven if she steps up, where it doesn't hurt to try, but how it hurts to see, but the actual actions taken later on and what we've learned up to this point, that we were led to believe that she was the villain of the film, but sadly smacked in the middle, we are now revealed that this wasn't the case at all. Sure, she acts antagonistic and is listed as such, but the film and the people making it did not want that perspective to be shown. This is seen when Raya finally gives her gift back to her and invites her to see Sisu and reunite all the gem pieces once and for all in this scene as they make a soup combining all the best ingredients, again just as their father did to reunite the tribes. That it's better to be as one rather than to have a missing piece. And now that they're both finally ready to come all together to give the good pieces back, a good change of heart can happen to become better rather than the supposed non-villain that Namari is. But how she portrays all of that yet again when she pulls out her crossbow and immediately ruins her own character once more. Like, after everything we were building up to, she just decided to remain loyal to her people's wishes and threaten the lives of her crew for the sake of restoring their own name, reminding you that all of them should never have trusted Feng because she literally just went straight back to her younger preteen self. It might not be the slight attitude she showed way back then, but it's still another backstabbing event that makes things hard for her since she reluctantly agreed to help Sisu actually help her. Plus, we obviously see that she has her finger on the trigger ready to kill anyone out of the moment just like Sisu, making her motivations and conflictions untrustworthy to be unredeemable. And so this is the point where things start to get hard for me, and something I still thought about talking for a long while, delaying this film in the first place. The scene where Sisu says that she does trust Namari, saying it to her face, which causes her to pause with emotion, but how Raya flings her sword to try to stop her to remove the bow, but how it fires towards Sisu. Like, there's a point that she acted out of panic to save Sisu by throwing the sword, which caused the crossbow to fire, but then you also saw that she had her finger on the trigger ready to pull it, slowly actually deciding to do it or not. So maybe she wouldn't have killed Sisu if it weren't for Raya's actions that triggered the bow, but then again she's still to blame for having it out where you wouldn't disagree with Raya's actions to do so, being so close to actually deciding to do it. But the filmmaker's perspective here, and by the actions we see in the scene when she actually flings it, is to just put it on Sisu's side to actually trust her to do the right thing, to become more sympathetic to Namari even though she might have decided to pull the trigger for some stupid arbitrary reason, metaphorically pulling the trigger in the sense that you could believe that Raya activated the trigger rather than Namari, even though again it gets harder to explain if we can slow down the scene. I mean, this doesn't change anything about what I've explained by other YouTubers that I fully agree about, but how you can get frustrated to understand what really went down in one instance if that glimmer of hope was really there. Doing this thing thinking the opposite effect would happen, but then coming to a head and being the most stupidest thing you could ever do. Seriously, do these clouds have to be the main villain of the film when Namari exists to frustrate every desire of a competent film that could have been? Like, you clearly had your villain right here and there, why couldn't you stick with that instead of take the blame on someone else? Because Raya's entire rage is completely justified in every sense of the word to attack her in a fantastic sword fight sequence with harsh impressive visuals, yet the movie just happens to have to be on her side to see it through after her mother gets stoned and the rest have to evacuate the city to culminate in this stupid conversation.
I never meant for any of this to happen. Liar! I don't care if you believe me. Sisu did, but you're as much to blame for Sisu's death as I am.
That after everything learned, Raya just happens to be as much to blame as Namari for something she did not cause by not trusting her in the first place. Where all of a sudden, she explains that she did not want to end up like this, but was also responsible for pulling the crossbow out and actually breaking the gem, ready to take aim and fire, but actually triggered by Raya for making the supposedly irrational choice, but how it's actually rational. The movie's over-reliance on this issue is just harming any regard for these events to logically take place, to have her forgive herself and remember her part with Sisu and what she did. Because just hammering it down our throats is going to make things worse rather than better in scenes like this, because you weren't afforded to actually give it real distinct decisions. Because Sisu going to her siblings did not prove anything of worth that should have been there on the characters that we meet from each tribe, including Namari herself, who never did got those points, never even attempting at solving these issues going replace the place so fast of why people advocate for this to be a series instead, but how it should have been like this because it was developed before Disney Plus and deserved to be a good movie. Where for the past 4 years, I've just tried so hard to understand their decision, reviewing what others have said about the film and what I've believed myself, trying to go back with their own beliefs in their production, but how I just still couldn't find any credible evidence that supports this story structure. I did look up all the employed techniques they used for the characters on the side of trust that they were on, but how that greatly ultimately ended up doing nothing that we noticed, since the word trust is just bashed into our head. To believe that this character is good because they just didn't want that, and that's enough to have her stopped from killing. It's just as muddled as the work that Don Hall would eventually go on doing with directing Strange World 2, which happened to be written and co-directed by this guy who also wrote Raya, strangely enough. I mean, I really don't want to knock them down for the work they do. They do have good passion for these stories, and that's great to learn about, but it's just not excusing the overall decisions that they made in both films. Raya happened to give us a taste of the same problems that they would face in Strange World, when you consider how that film lacked in a lot of areas, comparing what they set out to do in that film's environmental message and this film's unifying message, that they don't just have strong ideas or characters to do with it. Not even wanting to have a villain in any of these stories, and not having a proper send-off that they truly needed. That they just don't know how to execute an element well enough, where it just results in this stupid mess that doesn't need to happen for such a good idea. Only getting worse by the more they push it, by events they push like Namari deciding to help, but also not joining in with the gems to save at the last second when Raya does a 180 to actually trust her when she shouldn't have. Where they stupidly want tension in this scene to make you realize if she has the courage to do the right choice, even as they just admonish Raya for her inability to do just that. Like, up until the last second, they do everything in their own power to make Namari seem untrustworthy as possible until she actually does the thing, because like she just said earlier, that's the only thing that they could have done. Which that is just a breach of my own ability to trust them to make something good. Where in an ironic sense, these people just betray you, the viewer, into believing that anything could have been done right by placing it into the one that started it all and could have done this much earlier, never getting any better until the very end of the journey. It should have been on her to do this, even if their intentions are for them to forgive Fang for what they did. But why should I really forgive her after everything her mother also did was seeking to just use Sisu for everyone else to forgive them, for a nation that also wanted to expand because they just didn't have enough room without care that the other tribes would occupy these lands. Every decision that they created themselves was just proof that they were not worthy to become Kumaja or become trustworthy, not knowing any true motivation outside of it. Were to put our trust into this very character who had no choice but to do it at the very end is just a failure in understanding what real trust is actually about. I mean, fine, everyone's great to be restored once again, reuniting with their families like her father, and finally Kumandra is back on the hoe, but that doesn't change or absolve anyone of what they did, not even forgiving or apologizing for their own actions. What it does prove, on the other hand, is how no matter how great a message could be on paper or logically at all in society, it still depends on its execution. There is nothing wrong with the real overall goal to unite people despite their differences, but it's how you do it that counts, to show us the good and bad in people if they are worthy to receive or understand their faults, rather than focusing your efforts on one botched message that is more simple to figure out for yourself. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have put trust in the center of the film, but it shouldn't have been exploded to the way it was, where you get tired of actually hearing the word every 2 seconds. Especially again when they made their entire pop song center around that fact, if the movie just wasn't enough for us to understand. Because all we need to do in society is just to trust each other until they decide to stab us in the back and invade our land until we don't exist anymore. That's exactly the right message we should take away from this film. And that's why you should never take this message seriously to heart on this radical idea of completely blind-faithed trust, and instead rather turn to something like hope and understanding of those willing to change it. For in reality, we actually do not hate characters like Raya, embracing the best of them, but also hating the worst of their actions. It is just done with this hope that they could continue to try and tell stories in this region, but with the proper understanding and message of their values. And I'm all done. Goodbye.